What happens when a film hands you someone gentle, artistic, and emotionally vulnerable, then asks you to call him a monster? Today, we're talking about Edward Scissorhands, and how a suburban fairy tale teaches us who gets labeled a monster and why. Edward Scissorhands tells the story of an unfinished artificial man with scissors for hands who lives alone in a gothic mansion overlooking suburbia. When kind-hearted Avon saleswoman Peg Boggs discovers him and brings him home to her family, Edward briefly finds acceptance through his artistic talents, sculpting hedges, cutting hair, carving ice. But when his difference becomes inconvenient and he's manipulated into a crime, the neighborhood turns on him. Kim, Peg's daughter, eventually falls for Edward's gentleness. But after a violent confrontation with her aggressive boyfriend Jim, she chooses Edward's safety over romance, lying to the town that he's dead so he can live peacefully in isolation. This isn't just a monster story. It's a complete dismantling of monster mythology, rebuilt through the eyes of women who see what others refuse to, that Edward was never the danger. Society was. Edward doesn't fit the monster mold because he lacks the one thing classic monsters are built on: aggression. He doesn't rage or hunt or take up space with violence. Instead, he shrinks into corners, apologizes for existing, and spends his time creating beauty. His hands, the very thing that should make him monstrous, are used to sculpt gardens and ice, not to destroy. This is where the film becomes genuinely subversive. Edward is coded with traits traditionally associated with femininity: emotional expressiveness, nurturing instincts, artistic sensitivity. He's gentle in a way that makes people uncomfortable, because gentleness in a male-presenting body is treated as weakness or something suspicious. The film shows us that softness itself becomes a kind of monstrosity when it exists outside acceptable boundaries. Edward's tragedy isn't that he's too dangerous, it's that he's too kind, and the world doesn't know what to do with that. Johnny Depp gives Edward a soulfulness that could have easily become caricature. Tim Burton saw in Depp someone who understood the conflict between public perception and private truth. Depp was trying to break away from being seen as just another teen heartthrob. That tension became Edward's emotional core, making him heartbreakingly real. Fear isn't natural in this film. It's taught, performed, socially constructed, then weaponized. When Edward first arrives, the neighborhood women are fascinated. They invite him into their homes, ask him to cut their hair, parade him around like a novelty. But this acceptance is conditional. Edward is loved only as long as he remains useful, entertaining, and non-threatening to the social order. The moment he steps outside those boundaries, the acceptance evaporates. What replaces it is moral panic. The women who welcomed Edward now gossip and speculate. Esmeralda frames him as demonic. The town doesn't need evidence of Edward's danger. They need a narrative that justifies their discomfort, and Edward's difference provides it. This mirrors historical witch hunts and moral panics, showing how communities manufacture fear around those who don't conform. The film's most pointed observation is the contrast between Edward and Jim. Edward, with his scarred face and scissor hands, is visibly different. Jim looks completely normal, clean-cut, charming, exactly the kind of guy suburbia trusts. But Edward never initiates harm. Jim does. Jim manipulates, bullies, and escalates every situation toward violence. He's jealous, entitled, and willing to destroy Edward to reassert his dominance. Yet the town never frames Jim as the problem. They frame Edward as the danger, because Edward's difference is visible, and Jim's cruelty is not. The film makes this explicit. Imagined danger is feared more than actual harm. Edward's hands represent potential violence, so he's treated as monstrous. Jim's behavior represents real violence, but because it's packaged in a familiar form, it's excused and enabled. This is how patriarchy functions, by making aggression seem normal and punishing anyone who disrupts that norm. In traditional Gothic stories, the Dark Castle is the site of horror. Edward Scissorhands flips this entirely. The castle is Edward's sanctuary, the one place where he's safe, where he can exist without judgment. The real horror is suburbia. Those pastel houses and smiling neighbors represent a violence that's harder to name, but no less destructive. It's the violence of conformity, of conditional acceptance, of cruelty disguised as concern. The town looks welcoming, but it's built on exclusion, functioning by deciding who belongs and who doesn't. Burton shot the film in a Florida suburb that reminded him of Burbank, where he grew up feeling like an outsider. The production became an endurance test. Johnny Depp threw up twice from heat and heavy costume. Bugs swarmed so thick they shut down filming. That discomfort bleeds into every frame, making the neighborhood feel actively malicious. By framing the Gothic mansion as safe and suburbia as hostile, the film redefines where monstrosity actually lives. It's not in the shadows, it's in the daylight, in the places that insist they're normal. Edward is humanized because of the women who choose to see him differently. Peg doesn't scream when she finds him. She looks at him with compassion, then brings him home. Diane Wiest plays Peg with subtle warmth that makes her the emotional anchor, maternal without being overbearing. Kim eventually initially recognizes Edward's gentleness and falls for the kindness underneath. The film centers female perception as the lens through which Edward is allowed to be seen as human. Peg's maternal instinct drives the first act of empathy. Kim's emotional awakening lets her see past fear. These women don't fix Edward, they simply see him, and that act of seeing reframes the entire narrative. This matters because it positions empathy as a specifically feminine mode of understanding. The men in the film, Bill, Jim, the police, treat Edward as a curiosity or threat. They never see him as a person, but Peg and Kim do, and their perception becomes the film's moral center. Kim's decision to lie about Edward's death is tragic, but it's also an act of agency. She chooses Edward's safety over her own desires, sacrificing the possibility of being with him to protect him from a world that would destroy him. This isn't passivity, it's a moral calculation, a recognition that love doesn't always mean staying. Tom Cruise reportedly turned down the role because he didn't like the unhappy ending and wanted Burton to change it. Burton refused. That refusal is significant. It suggests the ending isn't a failure of imagination, but an intentional choice. The film refuses the fairy tale resolution because that resolution would be a lie. Edward and Kim can't be together in suburbia. The world won't allow it. Through a feminist lens, this ending becomes less about loss and more about what women are often forced to do, make impossible choices to keep people they love safe. Kim doesn't get the fairy tale ending. Instead, she becomes the guardian of Edward's story, the one who keeps him alive by keeping him hidden. The film suggests this is the only way Edward survives, not by being healed or accepted, but by being removed from a society incapable of protecting him. The world doesn't fix the people it harms, it just hides them. So yes, Edward was never the monster. The real horror was always the town that couldn't accept gentleness, couldn't tolerate difference, couldn't see past fear long enough to recognize care. Burton's most personal film becomes his most political, a story about what happens when society treats vulnerability as a threat and kindness as something that must be contained. This is Ladies First, watching women in movies. Here, we empower women by reviewing and discussing films that highlight their stories, struggles, and achievements. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments.